She did not make it.
At first, Brittany Delgado acted like she believed she would soon be going home. She described herself as a caring mother and insisted she had done everything she could for her children. Then, detectives told her the news no parent ever wants to hear. Her 1-year-old daughter had died. Tears followed, but investigators kept looking at the evidence instead of the emotion. As they rebuilt the timeline minute by minute, they believed the truth inside that small bedroom was far more disturbing than the story they had been told. On the afternoon of December 10th, 2019, deputies with the Leon County Sheriff's Office received an emergency call from a home on Dome Level Road in Tallahassee, Florida. A mother reported that her 2 young children were not waking up. They were not breathing, and they needed help right away. Deputies rushed to the house. When they arrived at about 1:15 p.m., they found a terrible scene. Inside the home were 2 small children, only 1-year-old and almost 4 years old. Both children were lying unconscious. Neither child was breathing. Their bodies felt very hot to the touch. The deputies immediately began CPR while waiting for firefighters and paramedics to arrive. Every second mattered. Soon, crews from the Tallahassee Fire Department and Leon County EMS reached the home and took over emergency care. The children were quickly placed into ambulances and rushed to a nearby hospital. Doctors immediately noticed something was seriously wrong. Both children had extremely high internal body temperatures. Each child's temperature was measured at more than 106.5 degrees. These temperatures were far above normal and matched severe heat stroke. The younger child, 1-year-old Alexius, could not be saved. Despite emergency treatment, she died shortly after arriving at the hospital. Her older brother remained in critical condition as doctors fought to save his life. While medical teams worked at the hospital, deputies stayed behind to examine the house. What they found raised many questions. The children had been found inside a small bedroom. At first glance, nothing seemed badly damaged or broken, but investigators quickly noticed something important. A portable space heater was sitting inside the room. It was unplugged when deputies saw it, but the control dial was still turned to a high heat setting. That detail immediately caught their attention. Even more surprising was the temperature inside the bedroom. About 45 minutes had already passed since the children had been removed. The bedroom door had also been opened during that time. Even so, investigators measured the room and found that it was still in the high 80s. That meant the room had been even hotter before emergency crews arrived. The bedroom itself was also in poor condition. Trash was scattered around the floor. A dirty diaper had been left inside. The room had very little furniture and very few items meant for young children to play with. Investigators carefully photographed everything exactly as they found it. Every object inside the room could help explain what had happened during the morning. The children's mother was 26-year-old Brittany Nicole Delgado. She lived in the house with her boyfriend, Pedro Ramirez Alvarado. According to Brittany, Pedro had helped care for the children and had taken on the role of a father figure. The children's biological father had not been involved in their lives since they were born. Detectives separated Brittany and Pedro so they could speak with each of them individually. Investigators wanted each person to explain the day's events without hearing the other's answers. At that point, detectives were still trying to understand one simple question. How had 2 small children suffered such dangerous overheating inside their own home? As detectives began putting together the timeline, they learned the family had returned home from Panama City around midnight after a long drive. The weather had been cool overnight. Brittany later explained that the bedroom felt cold, so a space heater had been turned on before everyone went to sleep. The sleeping arrangements were unusual. Pedro slept in the bedroom with 1-year-old Alexius. Brittany slept on a couch in the living room. The older child, Julio, was also sleeping outside the bedroom because another room in the house was being cleaned. Everything appeared normal overnight. Around 7 a.m., both children woke up. According to Brittany, she moved them into the bedroom to play while she stayed nearby inside the home. She later said she unplugged the heater and moved it into the hallway because she did not want the children touching it. She also claimed the older child kept plugging the heater back into wall outlets whenever he found it. That statement would later become one of the most important parts of the investigation. Brittany explained that she spent much of the morning on the phone with an insurance company. She said the calls lasted several minutes at different times. Pedro also spent part of the morning outside while talking on his own phone. Meanwhile, the children remained together in the bedroom. Brittany said she checked on them several times while moving between her phone calls. She described them as awake, walking around, and playing with toys. Alexius had only recently learned to walk. Brittany said she enjoyed pushing a toy stroller around the room. Julio was active and liked moving from place to place. Everything seemed ordinary. Nothing suggested that a medical emergency was about to happen. Late that morning, everything suddenly changed. Pedro called out for Brittany. He told her to come quickly. When Brittany entered the bedroom, she found both children lying on the floor. Neither child was responding. Julio was lying on his back. Alexius was lying on her side. Brittany immediately tried to wake them, but neither child reacted. She began CPR on Alexius using training she said she had learned years earlier. She gave chest compressions and rescue breaths while Pedro attempted CPR on Julio. At the same time, Brittany called 911. The dispatcher gave instructions over the phone while emergency crews rushed toward the house. The dispatcher told the adults to continue CPR and to move the children into fresh air if possible. The situation inside the home was chaotic, as both adults tried to help the children before deputies arrived. As investigators examined the house, they found details that did not fully match the first explanations they received. Brittany said the bedroom door had been open. However, investigators questioned how such extreme temperatures could have developed if cool air from the rest of the house had been flowing inside. The house had working air conditioning in other rooms. The dangerous heat appeared to be limited mainly to the bedroom. Investigators also looked at the electrical outlets. Brittany later said child safety covers had been placed on them. Photographs taken during the investigation did not appear to show those covers in place. These details did not answer what had happened, but they showed investigators that every part of the timeline would need careful review. While deputies were still processing the scene, another family member arrived at the house to collect the mail. According to investigators, the relative made a statement that immediately drew attention. "I knew this was going to happen." Detectives asked the family member to explain. The relative described earlier concerns about the children. She said she had previously found them outside without adult supervision. She also said they sometimes appeared dirty, and believed there were times when they had gone much of the day without eating. Investigators documented every statement because it could help build a clearer picture of the family's daily life. As detectives continued reviewing records, they discovered law enforcement had already been called to the same home only weeks before. On November 3rd, officers responded after reports that a young child, believed to be about 4 years old, had been seen walking alone down the road without shoes. When deputies arrived during that earlier incident, they found Brittany asleep inside the house while the child was outside. That earlier call became part of the overall investigation as detectives examined the family's history of child supervision. Before the case moved into court, investigators had already spent hours comparing Brittany Delgado's statements with the evidence collected from the house, the medical findings, and witness interviews. The more they looked at the timeline, the more they believed the children's injuries could not be explained by a brief accident. Detectives concluded that the extreme body temperatures and the heat inside the bedroom pointed to prolonged exposure rather than a sudden event. Based on the evidence gathered that day, the Leon County Sheriff's Office arrested 26-year-old Brittany Nicole Delgado on a charge of aggravated manslaughter of a child. As the investigation continued, additional charges related to child neglect were also pursued. Pedro Ramirez Alvarado, who had also been caring for the children, was detained during the investigation. Authorities later charged him in connection with the same incident. Investigators also determined that Pedro was in the United States without legal immigration status, and he was transferred to Immigration and Customs Enforcement while the criminal case continued. After the arrests, detectives continued reviewing every detail of the interviews. Brittany had explained that she and Pedro shared responsibility for caring for the children. She said Pedro had stepped into the role of a father, even though he was not their biological parent. During questioning, Detectives focused on that point. They asked why 2 adults were home that morning, yet 2 very young children had been left alone in another room. Detectives pointed out that Brittany herself had described the heater as something the older child repeatedly unplugged and plugged back in. They questioned why the children were allowed to stay near it if everyone already knew it could become a problem. Brittany answered that she never believed the children were playing with the heater itself. She insisted she had checked on them several times and believed they were safe. Investigators then questioned why the children were not brought into the living room where both adults were spending most of their time. They explained that officers had found almost no toys inside the bedroom after the emergency. Brittany responded that toys had been there earlier in the day. She said she did not know why they were no longer in the room when. Deputies arrived because Pedro had been checking on the children later that morning. Detectives noted that the room mainly contained a stroller, trash, towels, and the space heater. Brittany agreed that it looked unusual, but maintained that the room had looked different earlier. The discussion then shifted to the layout of the bedroom. Detectives asked about a mattress and a portable playpen that had once been inside. Brittany explained that the room had originally been prepared for someone who planned to rent part of the home. When that arrangement fell through, she and Pedro intended to use the room for storage and as a play area. Investigators continued asking why the children had remained there for such a long period instead of staying with the adults in the main part of the house. The conversation also turned to previous involvement by child protection workers. Detectives asked Brittany about a recent visit from child welfare officials. She said Pedro had told her someone from the agency had come to the house around Thanksgiving, but she claimed he never explained the full conversation or any safety plan that had been discussed. She said she asked whether he had received a business card or contact number, but never obtained additional information. Detectives replied that the agency had recommended cleaning the home and making safety improvements for the children. Brittany answered that she did not know all of those recommendations because Pedro had not shared them with her. When detectives showed concern about the condition of the home, Brittany explained that both she and Pedro had recently spent several days working in Panama City. She said they often returned home very late at night, sometimes after 1 a.m., leaving little time to clean the house. She admitted the home had become messy and said she had planned to spend that day doing a deep cleaning. According to Brittany, she had already argued with Pedro because she felt he had not helped enough with household chores. She told detectives she expected him to help clean while she handled other responsibilities. Investigators asked how she normally managed childcare while cleaning. Brittany described what she considered her usual routine. She said the children would stay where she could see them, usually on the sofa watching television, or the younger child would remain inside a playpen while the older child stayed nearby. Detectives pointed out that this description was very different from what had happened on the day of the emergency. Brittany agreed that the children should normally have been closer to an adult. She suggested that somehow they had made their way back into the bedroom while she remained occupied with her insurance phone call. Detectives returned to one of the most important questions in the case. They explained that, based on the evidence, the bedroom likely remained closed for a significant amount of time. Brittany continued to insist that whenever she checked on the children, the door had been open. She suggested that Pedro might have accidentally closed it during one of his visits to the room, but she said she could not be certain. Detectives emphasized that the extreme heat measured inside the room and the children's dangerously high body temperatures were difficult to reconcile with her explanation. Brittany maintained that she did not know exactly what had happened during the final minutes before the children were discovered. As questioning continued, detectives also explored the family's daily life. Brittany described disagreements between herself and Pedro over household duties, money, and parenting. She stated that Pedro was not the children's biological father, and said they sometimes argued about how the children should be disciplined. Brittany claimed she did not agree with physical punishment, and said she had objected when Pedro disciplined the children in that way. She also acknowledged that balancing work, appointments, cleaning, and caring for young children had been difficult. Although she described those challenges, detectives reminded her that young children still required constant supervision regardless of the family's daily pressures. Investigators also reviewed earlier reports involving the family. They noted that the older child had previously wandered away from the home without adult supervision, leading to law enforcement contact before this incident. Combined with statements from relatives and child welfare records, Detectives believed there was a pattern of inadequate supervision rather than a single isolated mistake. Those earlier concerns became part of the overall case presented by prosecutors. As the criminal case moved forward, prosecutors relied heavily on physical evidence collected from the home. Temperature measurements inside the bedroom, the heater's position and settings, photographs from the scene, medical records showing the children's extremely high core temperatures, and testimony from investigators formed a central part of the prosecution's case. Prosecutors argued that the injuries were consistent with prolonged exposure to excessive heat, while the children remained alone inside the room. They maintained that both adults had a legal duty to protect the children and failed to do so. The defense presented a different view. Brittany maintained that she never intended to harm either child and argued that she believed the children were safe while she handled phone calls and household responsibilities. She denied intentionally leaving them in dangerous conditions and disputed suggestions that the bedroom had remained sealed for an extended period. Even so, prosecutors argued that criminal responsibility did not require proof that anyone intended to cause death. Instead, they focused on what they described as reckless neglect that created an obvious and life-threatening risk for two very young children. The court also heard evidence about the family's previous involvement with Child Protective Services. Prosecutors argued that earlier concerns about supervision and home safety demonstrated that warnings had already been given before the fatal incident. Witness testimony and investigative records were introduced to show that recommendations had been made to improve the living conditions and protect the children. Prosecutors argued those recommendations had not been fully followed. After reviewing the evidence, the court found both Brittany Delgado and Pedro Ramirez Alvarado criminally responsible. Brittany was convicted of aggravated manslaughter of a child and aggravated child neglect. The court sentenced her to 25 years in prison before she becomes eligible for parole or other forms of release under applicable law. Pedro Ramirez Alvarado was also convicted in connection with the same case. He received a sentence of 30 years in prison, followed by a period of probation. The case remains a tragic example of how investigators use witness statements, physical evidence, medical findings, and prior records to reconstruct events inside a home. By comparing interviews with scientific evidence, detectives built the timeline that prosecutors later presented in court. The surviving child ultimately recovered from the immediate medical crisis, while the loss of 1-year-old Alexius remained at the center of the case. The court concluded that the adults responsible for the children's care had failed in that duty, and the criminal sentences reflected the seriousness of those findings. Do you think the sentences were fair, or should they have been different? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.